Welcome back to our interview with Jason O'Neill, former CEO of Dendreon and Iridium Therapeutics and the author of The Secrets of Successful Drug Launches.
This is the second part of our two-part episode where we dive deep into successfully launching new drugs. Now, back to the conversation with Jason O'Neill.
So let's now switch the focus on how to develop a realistic launch plan and execute it flawlessly, from market preparation to organizational readiness. So now we are moving from the early development to maybe 12 to 18 months before launch. What critical steps should our biotech be taking during the pre-launch period to prepare the market and the organization for the launch day?
Well, Martin, the best research we have on pre-launch preparation suggests that the most successful companies invest disproportionately in four key areas. They are commercial, medical affairs, market access, and patient advocacy. And not only do they invest more in these four areas, but they tend to activate these functions earlier. So if I put it into months, on average, the successful companies initiate their commercial activities 26 months pre-launch. They initiate their medical affairs activities 25 months pre-launch. They initiate their market access activities 20 months pre-launch, and they initiate their patient advocacy, and let's call it patient operations activities, 20 months pre-launch as well. So you mentioned a time frame of 12 to 18 months. It's quite a bit earlier than that. And so that's interesting. And it's always good to have benchmarking information on that. I think I would consider these general guidelines. And I think each product can be a little bit different. So I think one of the things that some of the most successful companies that I've been a part of and that I've seen do is they conduct what's called a pre-mortem exercise early in the launch process. And a pre-mortem is simply an exercise where you bring together really knowledgeable people about the category you're about to enter, and you present them with the following scenario. The drug you're developing is already in market. It's 9 months into the launch, and the product is dramatically underperforming. So it's failing. And you ask that team in the room to say, okay, it's failing. I want you to predict for me the 2 or 3 reasons why that launch is failing. And it's a really valuable exercise for a couple of reasons. First, it identifies those 2 or 3 deliverables that will create below the waterline holes in your boat if you fail to navigate and manage them effectively. So it creates a real sense of priority around the resources you allocate, the people you hire, what you're willing to pay to bring impact players in to your organization in those key areas. So it helps to really prioritize, but it also helps to ensure that these 2 or 3 things remain on center stage. They never leave. You create kind of a healthy shared paranoia around these things. And the companies that do this, I think many of them will end up picking these 4 different disciplines that I just talked about, but there may be 1 or 2 that are so important that they're willing to find the very best person in the industry and bring them in and bring their whole teams in so they mitigate that risk. So I think that's the general, I'd say, research on pre-launch preparation and the more specific guidance that you'd want to get before a launch as early as you can.
And just before I hand over to Simon, so this pre-mortem, the best time for it, would that be the 20 to 25 months before launch?
I would say you want to do it as early as you can. The challenge is that you won't have your full team on board at that point. And so ideally, you want the whole team to be aware of the pre-mortem and to be aware of those priorities. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but you really need enough people in the room who really understand the category you're going into. If you don't have enough, then you want to bring in advisors with tremendous experience to weigh in on it, because it's just so important to get it right. But it's also important that you have everybody in the room, because like anything else, when you're developing strategy, you want to bring everybody under the tent so they have a chance to kind of weigh in on it and feel like they own it. They don't take ownership of it. They may actually pursue their own priorities that may not be consistent with what you really need to drive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, now it's finally my turn formally. I remember early in my career, I remember people in the pharma companies talking about preparing the market. And I think that was super intriguing. And I didn't dare asking at that time. And if there are people out there who don't dare ask today, so what does this prepare the market actually mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think a lot of us know what it really means. The other day, I'll answer that question by reflecting through the lens of those 4 disciplines we touched on earlier. So let's take commercial to begin with, right? And I think in that pre-launch period, I think the commercial team's job really is to define where you're going to compete, which market segment or segments are you going to compete in? And then how are you going to win in these segments? And when you say, how are you going to win, it's a confusing statement, but specifically, which activities are you going to do differently than your competitors to distinguish the jobs that you've chosen to perform for those customers? And it's really a set of activities you're doing differently. If you're doing the exact same thing that your competitors are doing, then you're going to get the same outcome. There'll be no differentiation. It'll be like, going to an airport. Every airline has the exact same strategy. They do the exact same thing and they don't do it very well. But I think you've got to define, again, where you're going to compete and then what activities you can do differently to distinguish the jobs that you've chosen to perform for your customers. So that's the commercial team's job in that pre-launch period. And once they've defined that together with the rest of the team, they've got to make sure there's tremendous alignment behind it and that everybody's really marching down that path together. The medical team's job in the pre-launch setting is different. Their job is to really identify the most influential, most impactful key opinion leaders and then persuade them by exposing them to clinical evidence, by getting them involved in trials and registries, et cetera, persuade them that this is a drug that is very good and get them ready so that when the prescribers, the high prescribers, ask them their opinion after the drug has been approved and is available in the marketplace, they say it's a good drug and I recommend that you use it. So that's their job. Their job is to find those opinion leaders out there and persuade them to endorse the product. That's really the medical team's almost sole job in the lead up to launch. Market access, their job is to ensure broad, unfettered access for the product. I think you want as few prior authorizations as you can possibly have, few step edits, et cetera. You want as frictionless a process as you can have, and you want a lack of complexity. You want to minimize complexity because it kills new product adoption. Complexity is one of those things that can be, again, there's certain attributes or certain factors that can magnify success or that can diminish success. And complexity is one of those things that can really undermine relative advantage. It's one of the things most able to do that. The fourth area or fourth discipline would be patient advocacy, or let's call it patient operations as well. If you're working on a cell or gene therapy, it's a big patient operations component there. I think their job is to ensure that the patient's experience as they go through the process of obtaining the drug, of sort of administering the drug, et cetera, they want to make sure that experience is as smooth and frictionless as possible. And this is really important because if the patient's experience is good, then the nurses who are closest to those patients, they get positive feedback, which they then share with the physicians. I've worked on a number of brands that had incredibly complex, almost entirely prior auth products, very expensive. We had to fight for like a month to get people on the drug and fight like dogs. It was incredibly challenging. And when the doctor would prescribe the drug, the nurses would sometimes roll their eyes and look at the doctor and be like, really? I don't have time. I don't have time for this product. And they would discourage the doctors from writing it, without a doubt. And they were discouraging them because the patient would be giving that feedback to them. So that's their job, is to think through that process of how the patient gets the product, how fast it's going to happen. They want to find out what the best-in-class experience is, and then essentially design a process to deliver, to get patients on the drug in 1 week and not 1 month, 2 months, So those would say with those four domains, that would be kind of their target jobs in that pre-launch period, if I, kind of take it at a very high level.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's a quite massive effort just to also for everyone in the organization across the value chain to understand what does that prepare the market actually mean. And just to change the topic a little bit, we talked very early on in the conversation about forecasting and the inaccuracy of drug sales forecasting. So why is it so difficult to predict or forecast how much a drug will sell?
I think that we touched on this a little bit earlier when Martin raised that question. Does the endowment effect and the status quo bias, do they affect the companies developing products in the same way that they affect the prescribers who are considering adopting these new products? And they really do. So they have the exact same effects. These people tend to be oversensitized to the issues with existing products. They tend to be undersensitized to the very marginal benefits that they're bringing. They think of their own product as the new standard of care before it's even been launched. And as a result, they're like a parent that falls in love with their child. It can do no wrong. And so they tend to overvalue their products in development by a factor of 2 to 4 times, depending on how long they've been working with the product. And unfortunately, their customers tend to undervalue those same products by a factor of 2 to 4 times. So that distortion is almost impossible to overcome. And so we have very, very inaccurate forecasts. The interesting thing is that it was a great publication on sell-side analysts and the accuracy of their forecasting. You would think that sell-side analysts, because they're not developing the drug, they don't have a personal affection for the drug, that they would be more accurate. And I think they probably are more accurate, but they're still very inaccurate. This piece of research, maybe we'll put this in the episode notes here, but it found that as far down the path as year 6 after the product has been approved, they are still routinely overestimating the sales of the drug by 45%. So in year 1, they're well over 100%, but by year 6, they're still overestimating the potential of this product by 45%, which is just gigantic. So it just tells you how difficult it is. And in the book, we dive into a couple of practical solutions, but this will be a hard one for companies to resolve. And I think people at the highest levels in companies probably should have some factor for discounting all of these biases that ultimately do portfolio valuations where they're like, this just can't be possible. I'm just gonna cut it in half or something like that. They really need to find a completely objective, non-involved party who can find a way to properly value these portfolios.
Yeah, I agree. And so talking about resources again, so where is it you see that companies typically underinvest? What is the practical recipe? Where do companies typically underinvest when launching a new drug?
Well, I'd like to say that it's in only a couple of areas, but it really is they almost underinvest everywhere. And this is particularly true for first-time launchers. I mean, first-time launchers are often attempting to really piecemeal that investment while they double down on the clinical investments, and ultimately they arrive at the market and they're really unprepared. I think that if companies are forced to make trade-offs, and of course they do, I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of Pollyanna, but they will have to make trade-offs. And if they're going to make trade-offs, I think the best way to do that is to, again, conduct a pre-mortem as early as you can, identify those priority areas that are must-succeed areas, and make sure that they overinvest in those areas. One of the things that's true about launching new products is there are literally thousands of decisions and actions you need to take to get ready for a launch. And they're just not all equally important. And the pre-mortem helps you understand which ones are just absolutely essential. And so I think that's what I would do up front is try to set the priorities, make sure you're certainly not starving those priorities. And for companies that don't conduct pre-mortems, which is most companies, I think the one domain, the one critical pre-launch area that they should never underinvest in is market access. I think if a product cannot get access, if it's an incredibly cumbersome process, it takes a long time. Physicians have no patience for this. They will not prescribe it. And nurses will not support the prescribing of it. Patients will not support it. So that's one that if you had to prioritize one, that would be my priority number one for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And maybe a little bit along the same lines, let's say that I'm a small biotech company or any other organization, maybe with a limited budget. Is there a way to do a low cost launch?
Yeah, well, I wish there was, but really there is as they say, there's no shortcuts to greatness. There really is no such thing as a low cost strategy, I must say. There really is not. I think you've got to invest more than you think is wise in virtually every area, every major area of your launch preparation. So it's one of the few areas where you just need to uniformly overinvest because you don't know those areas that you invest less. That might be the most important area over time, or maybe more important than you think. So there's really no such thing as a low cost strategy. And I think what happens for a lot of particularly first time launchers is they underinvest they should be starting a lot of these activities 2 years or more pre-launch. They do not. We get to month 12 pre-launch and month 9 pre-launch. And then they say, wow, we're raising the capital now to really go full speed. And they say, let's compress this 2 years of activities into 9 months, right? And the problem with that is that many of these activities are sequential in nature. So one analysis, one project informs the next project, informs the next. So you really can't compress those timelines in many cases. And so ultimately companies have to make the decision, do I delay the launch to make sure I'm ready and maybe forego some sales? Or do I just launch on time and take a greater risk that the sales will not come? And so either way, it's not a great situation to be in, but it's unfortunately a situation many companies find themselves in. And I think if you were a company that's smaller and you find yourselves, let's say 12 months before launch, you're very close now, and you have done none of the very, very important work, and you're a first-time launcher, I think you've got to really consider finding a partner. Because even if let's say you pick a partner with therapeutic area experience, a big global company, it may be a smaller pie for you. I think when they out-license assets, companies might claim 80% of the value of the asset, but it's going to be probably a bigger pie. Whereas if you take it yourself, the pie may be just so small that yes, you've got 100% of it, but basically, so I think you've got to be very pragmatic, and it's very hard to do because everybody is so in love with their product at that point. They've been working with it for 10 years or 5 years or whatever the time period. So it's extremely difficult to ask people to look at that decision objectively. But really, if you find yourself that close to launch, you need to be pulling the emergency cord and doing something quite a bit differently because you just don't have the skills of people. I mean, just hiring a person could take 6 months in some cases to find the right person.
Yeah. No, I think that's a clear advice, Jason. So you said, I mean, you can hardly over-invest, but I mean, there must be a limit. Also, we see the SG&A level in the pharma industry versus the R&D level. I mean, that there must be some point where the return on investment doesn't make sense. Or maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think we do waste a lot of money in the pharmaceutical industry, but I think we waste a lot of money, I would say, post-launch in many of the things we do. And I touched on this in the book. We won't get into it here, but I think things like direct-to-consumer advertising, I think there needs to be a better business case for that. I don't think
Yeah.
that it's justified at this time. But basically, I think as it relates to launching, can you spend too much? You certainly can. I think McKinsey did an interesting piece of research for first-time launchers in which they separated companies into those companies that spent more than 10 times their first year sales on their year one investments, and those companies that spent less than 10 times their first year sales on their first year launch spending. And the companies that spent more than 10 times had a 67% success rate. By that, I mean 67% of them exceeded their consensus analyst estimates for first year sales, whereas those that underinvested, just 29% exceeded their consensus analyst estimates for first year sales. So it seems like, investing to the point that it hurts actually seems to result in a better outcome. I think it's important to note that there's probably some selection bias in this, in that, companies tend to invest in products that they're very confident in as well. That could be playing a role there. But I think to your question, even the people who invest at the highest level, still it's just 2/3 of those products that really succeed and a third of them don't. So you could say that a third of those products overinvested for sure, but you have one choice: overinvest or underinvest. I'm going to go overinvest every time because if it's successful, it all works out over the long term. It's a no problem. But if it's not successful, it's an even bigger disaster, I think, than overspending.
Yeah, no, I think that's clear. And I think let's go to sustaining momentum post-launch. So, I mean, what happens after launch and how do we measure success? And how can we course correct? I mean, because it's one thing is to get it started preparing well, but then reality hits and either uptake is not as you hope for or expected. So let's say we have this fictional drug. What will we actually do in the first, let's say, 6-12 months? What should we be aware of and how can we course correct? And how do we know if you're on the right track? Because, this early, I mean, we have one quarter of sales and the analysts are asking, is this going well? And so how do we actually manage that after the launch?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think really successful companies prior to launch, they identify what they consider to be the key performance indicators. And I mean, across everything from sales, from customer access, market access, number of interactions, the time that it takes for a patient to get fully reimbursed. They establish really all of these different key performance indicators based on benchmarking data. So they understand like what best in class looks like. That's queued up in advance before the launch. And I think literally from the first week, the first month, they're studying those KPIs. They're looking for any variance relative to the benchmarks that they're shooting for. And in real time, they're trying to identify if there's variance. And sometimes the variance can just be natural variation. Sometimes it can be a problem. But they're looking at it in real time. They're pulling that information back to the teams. They're discussing it, what could be causing it. They drill down and talk to people who are closer to the customers. And they begin to get a clearer picture of why their performance is differing from what they were expecting. In some cases, it's not a big concern. In some cases, it is a big concern. They watch it very carefully. So I think that the key is really establishing based on benchmarks what best-in-class performance looks like. Having that really very clear for everybody in the team. And then you're meeting regularly. You're identifying any gaps there and trying to figure out whether this is a problem or whether this is just natural variation, and we'll keep a close eye on it, so to speak.
Yeah. So the organization basically has a dashboard with many, many KPIs. And I think the actual sales number coming in per month is just the tip of the iceberg. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, it is. It really is.
Yeah,
Obviously, that's the first one you look at. But sales can be driven by a good stocking of your product on shelves. You can great stocking. You're like, wow, what a great first, second month. And really, it's probably for some products, it's the best it ever gets. It never gets any better than that first 2 months of stocking. I've been a part of products like that. It's terrible. Yeah.
And how quickly can you actually tell that this launch is struggling or this launch is going beyond expectations? Is it weeks or is it months, quarters? How fast can you actually course correct or detect?
Yeah, it's a great question, Simon. I think the goal here is to the extent possible, try to separate signal from noise. And in my experience, I would say looking at performance in increments of less than 6 months, I think you get a lot of noise and not a lot of signal. So I would say the first important milestone for me has always been month 6. Obviously, you're looking very closely at performance before then, but your first 2 months could be great stocking and you outperform, and then things settle down, and then they got to work that inventory out of the pharmacies, et cetera. So I think month 6 is the first really meaningful time point. And I think that just historically, if you're looking for a trend, it's just hard to find anything meaningful in increments of less than 6 months, I think.
Okay, but I think that's very specific. And let's say that I end up being at this year one underperformer, and as you told us earlier on in the talk here, that rarely do we get a second chance, so to speak, if we get off to a bad start. But let's say you come in and I ask for your help, and we have just finished year one, and I'm struggling with my launch. Can I do anything?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think the research suggests that by the end of year one, that your initial trajectory is set. And if
Yeah.
you've overperformed in year one, then you're likely to overperform in year 2 and 3. And likewise, if you underperform, you're likely to underperform in years 2 and 3. But there are two things I think that can reliably bend the performance curve up. One of those things is a very aggressive life cycle plan. So if you've got new indications or potentially favorable new clinical data that shows some level of comparative advantage, those things I've seen can really change the trajectory of a product. I've seen that in a
Yeah.
number of cases because they essentially they trigger a reevaluation of the product by your customers. And they're one of the few things that can get your customers, after they've made up their mind, they generally remain consistent with their initial judgment until something like that gives them a real genuine reason for reevaluating that brand and how it could support their practice. So that's the first thing I would say is a life cycle change, life cycle option that emerges. The second one is I would say is improved market access. I've seen brands that have got a very restrictive, prior authorization situation for their product, and they somehow remove it. And now physicians can just prescribe it if they think it's going to be good for their patients. And that can have a huge impact as well. If it's a good product and it's just being hampered by a very restrictive payer policy, then that can really, because again, it reduces the complexity of prescribing, makes it more frictionless. And now people are willing to give it a try and see if it actually brings the benefit that the company has promised to their patients.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's a more radical solution and if after year one is too early, but sometimes you hear companies talk about relaunching the brand. I mean, maybe changing the messaging or the colors or whatever. What do you have any comments to that approach? When should I think about that?
I think when that happens, you want to start updating your resume and looking for a new job. Very few relaunches work. I will say that, when I was part of a product, I came into it a little bit late, that did successfully relaunch. It was a product called Actemra at Roche. It was a product in the rheumatoid arthritis category. It was the 10th entrant. This category dominated by Humira and Enbrel and some of these big heavyweights. And so this product came in, it didn't have any special indications, had a little more safety baggage, but it ultimately brought a superiority study versus Humira in a segment of patients to market. And it completely changed its trajectory. It ended up being a product that did more than $3 billion in revenue. Outstanding product, but it just had no reason for being used until it did some very aggressive and very frankly, it took some real risks. And I give the lifecycle team tremendous credit for it. They did a great job. They identified a potential weakness in Humira's in their dosing and delivered a huge win. And it just completely changed the game for that product. It became really a source of growth for many years, and Roche really needed it. So it can happen, but it's not that common, I would say.
Oh, I think that's a very fair point. And maybe back to this, let's say I'm then a year one overperformer and it's going way above what our wildest dreams on that launch. How do I then double down? I mean, do I just double the number of sales reps, or what's the most cost-effective way, so to speak, to ramping up that beautiful launch?
Yeah, I think I'd say new indications, new indications, new indications. I think if you've got a product that is very good and you can find additional sort of adjacent market segments where it performs some valuable job, I think you want to do as many new indications as you can. I think you want to front load them to the extent possible because, patent lives are limited. So it doesn't make any sense to do these things sequentially, do one indication, then 5 years later another, and then 5 years later another.
No.
Put them all at the starting line at the same time and shoot the gun in the air and go. And that requires a big organizational commitment. Obviously, you need multiple teams really to evaluate these different projects and then multiple teams to put them into clinical action, oversee the execution of these studies and on and on. So it's not like you can just say, oh, we're just going to do it. It requires a lot of resource allocation and thoughtful work up front to do that. But it's the greatest magnifier of performance that I've seen. And this is kind of reflected in a lot of the research around success in the industry.
I think that's really interesting. So you're actually advising against spending more dollars on TV ads or sales reps. So you actually put them back into the pipeline and then get the label expansions. Is that really the priority you recommend here?
Absolutely. I think, again, I think one of my favorite chapters in the book is the fallacy of DTC advertising. I encourage everyone to read it. I think this is an untapped area where we can shift resources to maybe funding more moonshots in terms of life cycle plans. And so I
Yeah.
think that there are certain areas that I touch on in the section that I referred to as cleaning up operations. But I think especially now that we've got sort of this specter of price cuts coming from the U.S. market finally. And I think if
Yeah.
that comes to be, then we're going to need to find ways to reallocate resources and shed, I think, useless activities so that we can still fund as many moonshots as possible, because I think R&D productivity is low and I don't think it's expected to change much. So we're just going to need to waste less money in other areas so that we can overinvest in new development.
So now stepping back, what are the top 2, 3 takeaways you want biotech and pharma leaders to remember once they have gotten your book, The Secrets of Successful Drug Launches?
Yeah, Simon, I think there's maybe a handful of things. The first one that comes to my mind is that new drugs need to be 2 to 4 times better than incumbents on some important dimension of performance. So it's not 15%, it's not 20%, it's not even 50%, which in the old days I thought would have been incredible. It's really 2 to 4 times better. And I think when we really begin to appreciate that and sort of integrate that thinking into our development plans, I think we're going to begin probably to take more risks in early development, but I think it's going to produce more competitive products at the end of the day. So that's the first thing. That's almost a change in our understanding of the world that I think very few of us have, and I hope that that is something people take away from the book. The next one I would say is that order of market entry can have a dramatic impact on performance, but it is situation dependent. So I really encourage people, to download, to print that famous McKinsey publication from 2014 and understand it really well. Because if you do, I think you're going to be better able as a company, as a drug developer, to identify the situations where you say, wow, every variable is going in my direction. We are going to overinvest in this asset. And if you're evaluating companies to buy, you're doing the same thing, but it just gives you a way to really understand the latent value in an asset in a way that very few people in the industry do today. So I think it gives you a leg up in prioritizing your own portfolio, in prioritizing acquisition targets and candidates, and undervaluing ones where you say, wow, thank God we avoided that. And that product had a lot of negatives, against it that would have probably made its success very unlikely. So that's the second thing I think I would say. I think the third thing is just speed in developing new indications. It just has the greatest ability to magnify or erase performance. I mean, I didn't mention one example, but it's the most obvious one. But Humira in the TNF inhibitor category began in the rheumatoid arthritis space. It was the third entrant. Enbrel launched in late 1998, Remicade a year later, and then 3 years later, Humira launches. But, 4 years after Humira launches, it introduces a series of very high impact new indications, things like psoriasis, things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. And essentially by 10 years into the launch of the category, it is the market leader. It becomes a dominant market leader and becomes the largest pharmaceutical product in the world. And it wasn't even the best product in the category. It had a dosing issue where, its lower dose was, I wouldn't say it's useless, but it was weak. And its higher dose was what you had to use in order to get the level of efficacy you needed, which was more expensive. So it had some natural disadvantages, but in spite of that, speed in developing new indications just overcame all problems. So I think that's the third thing I would say that I hope folks take away from our conversation today.
Thanks for that, Jason. They're all very actionable, and you gave a lot of food for thought. So let's try to see if we can give a few extra pieces of advice for the practitioners out there. So maybe to start, what advice would you give to the R&D leaders out there, work on their pipelines and having meetings with the commercial folks and maybe seeing the full life cycle of the molecules they are trying to develop? What should they take to heart?
Well, Simon, this will sound a little self-serving, but I would say buy this book. Buy this book, read it, understand it. It will make you smarter. It will make you better at your job. Honestly, this book is not my opinions. This book reflects the best, most important things I've learned over a 30-year career. So really, this book gives you an ability to master the best of what other people have already learned. So you don't have to learn all these lessons yourself. So I think the book is a great start. We're going to put a few links in the notes, I think, to this podcast that are I think you got to keep learning. You can never stop learning. You've got to keep reading the most important books and articles and seeking them out. And we'll put some great ones in here that really influenced this book the most. And I hope you'll have a chance to read them and benefit from them the way I have. So that's what I would say for leaders in the R&D function.
Yeah. And the same question for the commercial leaders out there. I mean, is the book more for R&D leaders or for commercial leaders? That's maybe a sub question. But what advice would you give to the commercial leaders?
Yeah, the exact same advice, without sounding gratuitous, read the book. I think the book was really designed for people who develop new drugs and the people who commercialize them. Because I think the extent to which they all share a similar language and understand the different root causes, they're going to have better conversations. And I think they're going to ultimately probably take more risk in the, in the early development, and ultimately it's going to make people much more successful later on. I think there are certain companies out there, and Genentech was one of them for many years. I had some exposure to the team there, and I think Regeneron's one today. They felt like we make products that are so good that we can succeed with average execution. That's how good our development is, right? And honestly, I'm happy with that. As a commercial person, I would love that. I would love to have a bunch of softball launches where, no matter what I do, it's going to be successful. I mean, that's not the reality, but it should be the goal. I think when I worked in that role as a global therapeutic area head, we tried to develop kind of our own internal mantra or kind of mission statement. And our goal was to develop drugs that are so good that they can succeed with even average execution. And I think that should be a goal of every development team. And obviously, it doesn't work out that way, then the commercial teams really got to earn their keep. But I think that should be the goal ideally.
And maybe I can sneak in one final question before I hand it back to Martin. So you talk about basically a lot of the things you said, Jason, that is raising the bar on the molecules out there in the pipelines today. So you say, okay, it needs to not be 15% better, it needs to be 2 to 4 times better. So I can imagine having you in the room during a portfolio review in a pharma or biotech company that I guess that the pipelines might look a little bit less full after that meeting, because you're also kind of saying that maybe we are developing too many low bar drugs. If you then also give advice to maybe the head of portfolio management out there in pharma or people involved in prioritizing the pipelines, because it seems like then you'll have to stop a lot because it's not every molecule that's 2 to 4 times better than, let's say, standard of care.
Yeah.
So what's your view on that? Or can that be sorted out by the commercial thinking, or would you actually stop more molecules?
Yeah, I think obviously we want more high impact drugs to come to market, but there's not an infinite number of these kinds of products. I think the goal, from my perspective, when we think about early development into late development, I think the goal is just to accurately reflect the value of these products in our forecasts to the extent we can. Then a company can make a decision as to how many really big moonshots they're willing to go after, how many real, how many real super innovative and pioneering products they're willing to invest in. So I think that's really the only goal. I think is visibility. I think if right now we're fooling ourselves to a certain extent in the way that we're forecasting. We're fooling Wall Street. And I think ultimately, we've had a bit of a growth issue in the pharmaceutical industry, certainly over the last 5 years, but there's many people, including some of the most talented investors, people like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who routinely declined to invest in our industry because they just didn't understand the economics of it. And so when we look at this massive decline in R&D productivity, and we look at the fact that the average peak year sales of products coming out of, let's say, the top 20 companies is declining down. It's less than 400 million now. When costs are going up and revenues are going down, it's not a desirable place to invest. So I think that we, as an industry, have got a growth and a credibility problem. And I think if we at least begin reflecting, the assets in our forecast more accurately, at least we know what we're dealing with, and then we can make decisions as to how we want to go about it. We certainly need to bring products, and I think it's totally reasonable to have 2 and 3 products from the same class come out. And sometimes 3 and 4 and 5, depending on how big the class is. If you get a share of that, it could be $1 billion drug. So I think that I'm not saying that everybody has to be, the most innovative product, but I think it would be better from the perspective of our industry to kill more of these Me Too products, because ultimately they're what's leading to this steady decline in peak year revenues among the top 20 global players, at least. And we know that costs are going up, and I'm not confident that that's going to change anytime soon. So I think start by just accurately reflecting what you have on your balance sheet, and then make better decisions that are going to convince investors to want to take the ride with you.
Over to you, Martin.
I think that's a very actionable takeaway. So we're coming towards the end, Jason, and I mean, there was so much that we discussed, but is there anything we didn't talk about that you feel like is important to add before we close the talk?
Not too much. I would say I think we're going to put a few different resources in the show notes here, but there's maybe two different things I would say, that 2 different sources that I'd love to just give a shout out to, that I think were particularly helpful in my development and certainly in the book as well. One is a book called The Diffusion of Innovations by a fellow named Everett Rogers. And it's just an incredible resource. It's not focused on any one individual industry, but more broad. And it's the greatest resource for understanding how products diffuse into a population and what drives and accelerates that and what holds it back. So it's a tremendous book. It covers many of the subjects that we've touched on today, but this Everett Rogers is just the pioneer in this field, and there's no resource that's better. The other sort of resource that, again, we can put in the show notes, but I think it's great, especially if you'd like to learn by ear, but listen to, audiobooks, is a book called Poor Charlie's Almanac, which is an autobiography of Charlie Munger, one of the world's great thinkers. And this fellow, his kind of ruminations on thinking are so valuable that I just, it's the kind of thing you can listen to 5 times and it doesn't bore you, because you say, wow, this is really impressive. And their performance, obviously, as investors, reflects that. But I think if everybody adopted some of that thinking, I think we would all benefit more.
Absolutely. And I mean, usually at this point, we ask the guest, what are you usually reading? But now it sounds like it's a lot of research papers.
Oh gosh,
and
I
business
I
books.
jumped the gun on that one. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Nothing else comes to mind that's quite as impressive as those two. So I'll leave it at those two, I think.
No, and those are 2 great recommendations. So, of course, as you mentioned, we will link to all the papers you have mentioned, and there's quite a lot. So there will be a lot of homework for the listeners, but I think it's all worthwhile resources. And I think one more thing left to do is, if our listeners want to reach out to you, what would be the best way to reach out? Would it be on LinkedIn or?
Yeah, LinkedIn's good. I leave my email address actually on the book itself. So it's just Jason at cardinalacademy.net, which is kind of a training and development organization that I launched a while back. So that's either of those things would be fine.
So, and of course, the book can be obtained from Amazon and probably a lot of other places, I assume. Is there
Yes, I think Amazon's an easy one at least for Americans. I'm not sure in every country, but that's an easy one.
And if there are any, the companies out there, if there were teams in biotech, whatever, and say, that's great, we need the book, but is it also possible to get advice from you? Can people call you? Do you offer, do you have an advisory, or it's only the book?
No, I do a bit of advisory work as well for companies that are working on go-to-market plans. So I do spend some time doing that. And so I'm open to the opportunities where I can help anytime.
Yeah, I'm sure the problem is huge out there. I'm absolutely confident about that.
I think it has been a great conversation, Jason. I have learned a lot, so I'm sure our listeners will too.
Me too.
So thank you very much
Excellent,
for joining
guys.
us.
Yeah, thank you both as well. And I really, hats
Take
off.
care.
Love the podcast and keep up the great work.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, guys.
So, Simon, this was our chat with Jason O'Neill. What did you take away?
I took away that now we have, once you get your drug approved, so you passed all the R&D risk, the probability of technical regulatory success, the PTRS, that's now in the rear mirror. But now you're looking into the probability of commercial success. You would say after the R&D phase, you're only halfway there. There's still a long way home to success. I think that's what I took away. And there's so much that can go wrong. There's so many things you need to do right to really say this is going to be a successful drug launch. It's going to have recoup the cost of its own development program, and also the development programs that never made it this far in your pipeline. So I think it just shows how difficult a business it is, even once it's out of the pipeline and it becomes an in-market drug.
I think Jason had a great point about this probability of commercial success, right? I really think it's something that is not being flagged around too often. And I mean, whatever numbers you get to, right, up to 66% of launches underperform forecasts. I mean, whether it is 50, whether it is 60, whatever high number it is, right? It's true that if you don't account for the probability of failure, I mean, then you are significantly overvaluing your drug assets.
Yeah.
He had this nice thing where he said that he believes that if you look at the pipelines of the major pharma companies, he would argue that a lot of those pipelines are overvalued purely because of this factor. And then, I mean, whether it is the psychological factors, the endowment effect, or loss aversion, or that we simply can't really forecast precisely, I mean, it can have quite a significant effect.
Yeah, I agree. And also, one thing is underperforming, we say a consensus forecast by investment bankers. But of course, a lot of the financial models are built around those in the banks. And we discussed a bit, you and I, before making this debrief on the call, that it's actually very hard to dig up the statistics for how many drugs fail in the commercial stage. We discussed, is it only 10% or 20% of drugs that actually recoup the investments from the R&D phase, whether you look at it in a sort of risk-loaded manner or otherwise. But it just tells us that there's a huge chunk of risk left once you're out of the pipeline. Maybe in the good old days, you thought, okay, now it's FDA approved, so now we have the revenue in front of us. But, there's a pressure on peak sales as well. We see the last numbers I saw, right? Peak sales are going down on average. Costs are going up. Timelines are going up. Probability of success is probably going sideways R&D-wise. So it's just so that continues to be this pressure on the entire system, and screwing it up in the commercial stage or even before, because there's a lot of planning efforts you need to be diligent around as well. I think this shows how incredibly difficult it is to have, the next Keytruda or some other, because it is those big brands that make the day in the companies, if you ask me.
But I mean, there is a reason why we started a podcast, right? If it was easy, I don't think we would need to start doing episodes with all these guests. But now we start to move in a direction where we also start to see some practical examples of what we can do about it, right? Yes, there's a lot of commercial failures. People are maybe overestimating what is sitting in their pipelines. But Jason also offered us some very practical, I believe, takeaways. He clearly told us that the bar to innovation is much higher than what people believed it to be. And this goes for across the organization. And I think just the pure fact of how early do you start those commercial considerations, you need to start very early on. And I mean, I gave Jason some random numbers, right? 12 to 15 months. And I mean, he doubled those numbers and went even farther. So I think it gives this consideration of how important it is to really do it early and how important it is to do it well. Because it's not just the probability of success in R&D, but if you don't do it well, then you fail right after. And here, this nice saying, if you have a low-risk product, high probability of success, you also have a high-risk launch, right? So there is more than just the PTRS.
Yeah, and I think we often see that, in portfolio management, we're always trading off maybe R&D risk versus commercial risk sometimes. And I think the further out we push the de-risking, and if you push it into the commercial stage by something that you can't sell, it only becomes worse the later on your failure is. And I think that's probably the most, there are so many drugs that should probably never have been launched, where of course hindsight, as we say, is 2020, but that's the worst place you can fail. That's in the marketplace for something that maybe should have been discontinued after phase 2, because the capital that is wasted, the resources that are wasted, is incredible. So I think that again tells us that, and we had earlier in other episodes, we discussed how early should bring in commercial, and you should basically bring it in the very, very early drug discovery to at least have some informed discussions on what could this drug candidate grow up to be. It's almost like a double helix that the R&D and the commercial functions need to work together throughout. And you're a big believer in tearing down the silos in the industry, Martin. So I think that this is just another confirmation that that's the way to go. And again, it's not, all the skills are out there, the expertise. So R&D is probably not rocket science, and commercialization is also not rocket science, but it's, again, the simple things done well, as we love to say on the podcast here. Be disciplined about launch planning. We discussed, the pre-mortem technique, for instance, is one example of critical thinking, disciplined decision-making, disciplined planning, but you still probably need to schedule it and call your team for a one-day workshop, asking the team what could go wrong.
But I think, I remember when we had a chat with Mike Ria, right? He said that, he said multiple things that were kind of related to this as well. He actually said that the worst thing you can do is increase probability of success in phase 2, so you then go fail into your phase 3, right? Now we kind of moved it one phase later, because the worst thing you can really do is do all of this and then fail in your commercial launch. So then you really pay all the costs and get nothing in return. But I think he also said something very nice, that was that your golden time for really thinking about all the paths to market is in your phase 1. And I think now we really got it reconfirmed by Jason as well. It's really the time also from a time to market perspective. If that's where you have to start thinking about commercialization perspectives. Anything later than that might just be too late. And especially if you're a new launcher with 0 to very little commercial experience, you want to do it as soon as possible. And he clearly pointed out, this is the kind of venture where if you do it wrong once, you might never catch up. So rather do it well and do it early.
Yeah, I think it's well said, Martin. I think that's really important. And we can get back to what happens if you underperform your launch in the early stages of launching a new drug. And I think you also said, again, this by pushing the risk into the future. Mike Ria said, okay, if you push it from phase 2 and into phase 3, and I think this maybe a quite common fallacy in the organizations out there, that is so tempting to try to increase the probability of success of the very next phase. And then maybe you're actually not unloading the risk you should be unloading in that stage, and then you push it. And if you then unload it later, it's much more expensive, and it's almost a tragedy for an organization, right, if it then doesn't go well. Another factor is that if you have an organization working on a product, it's so easy to maybe be a little bit blinded by how good or bad that drug profile might be. And Jason, he mentioned something that maybe I haven't been part of those, but he suggested to have, we have scientific advisory boards, you should have commercial advisory boards as well. And of course, sometimes you have advisory boards also to discuss a clinical profile, but it's maybe more this commercial operations view towards, sort of a realistic check on where you're going.
I think he had a point also in that, right? I can only imagine if you came into these kind of meetings, or the meetings where you try to bridge all the people from the commercial organization with the people from the R&D organization, and you come in, and as Jason said, right, and then you try to convince them that the drug doesn't just have to be 20% better, it has to be 2 to 4 times better, right? It's like, I can only imagine that you really need the backing of someone who has the proper experience, who can come and tell them, especially in the therapeutic area, listen, it's really important that the drug really goes over a certain threshold. So I can only imagine that really pulling in these people with this launch experience who can come and say, I have done this 3-4 times. These are the reasons why it failed. I think that might just be the place where people will start listening to it. I find that idea to be very practical, and it's not just for commercial people. I think all other parts of the organization should have such a thing. You should always get some kind of external perspective. And I really like to your part that you mentioned, Jason, he said this very nice thing. Now, I don't remember it word by word, but he said that launches, they are this kind of thing. You either pay me now or you pay me later. And I think it applies to not just launches. You can choose not to pay it now, but you will pay for it at some point in a certain way. And I think as it comes to drug development, you usually pay more later. So if you think you don't want to pay it now because it's expensive, it'll be much more expensive later, right? Either you fail in phase 3, much more expensive, or you fail in launch, very expensive. It might just be better to pay now and pay early, right?
And I was also struck reading Jason's book, The Secrets of Successful Drug Launches. And he goes over his first-hand experience of being involved in many drug launches. Also just how intense launch preparations really are. I mean, the organizational commitment involved, it's not some launch manager, director somewhere. It's if you don't have the full support of the top leadership in a company and you get put all the resources behind it, it doesn't go well. So I think it's a major undertaking for a company to launch. And I think another thing that also struck me in our conversation is about if you are a company either launching for the first time or you are a seasoned company launching into a new therapeutic area, then you need that extra safety margin to expect to do well. You really need a efficacy safety profile, differentiation profile, whatever, because you're probably going to do maybe a poor job because you have not launched into that space before. So you are in for a rough treatment with your competitors who've been there maybe for 30 years. So it's not easy to launch new drugs.
But I think he also said it very nicely, especially if you go into a new therapeutic area. You want the drug to be so good that it will offset any kind of underperformance from your side. And that's what you are likely going to get if you are especially a new time launcher and you compete against all these companies that have done it before. Just start thinking about it and start thinking about it early, right? Especially for biotechs. Majority of the drugs over the next couple of years or a decade are going to be launched by first-time launchers, right? This kind of advice is really important for them to hear. Because the biotechs especially, I mean, they focus as much as they can on really the clinical development to bring it to that last stretch, to bring it to market. But then once you are there, I mean, made a joke that maybe start thinking about commercialization perspective after approval is late, right? If that's really where they start thinking about it, then it's like the only thing you might be able to do is just partner up with some large pharma company, because there's no way you can basically bring it to market yourself if you start it late.
Yeah. There's also the point around the paradigm shifting therapies, because that's something that's always like the age you pull in a governance meeting. This is paradigm shifting, right? But it's paradigm shifting. Then you also need to reconfigure the whole system. And then, of course, there's the cell and gene therapy example, where it may come with trade-offs that hinder uptake.
I think one more thing to add, what Jason said, right, from this study that McKinsey did about the impact of being first to market, second to market, third to market, right? That on the first instance, it might appear that being first to market, that's really what you want to do, right? But then, as he mentioned, when they then deeper looked into it, just because you are first, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will go and overtake the market. And I mean, especially if you are first to market and then you kind of lay low and chill through, right? Because as he said, there are many drivers that can mitigate the first to market advantage, especially if the other companies out there either have the therapeutic area experience or more commercial experience, or they are more aggressive on their life cycle management. So I think that perspective was very interesting, because I believe that's a perspective that comes up a lot in all the meetings. We need to be first to market. And if we are first to market, then we are safe. And then we really take all of the pie. But that might not necessarily be the result.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Jason put some nice nuances to this first to market thing. I think on all things being equal, I think it's better to be first to market than something else. It makes it easier, but there are more, I mean, the devil is in the detail. Of course, there's the famous example with Lipitor we also briefly brought up, where it's fifth to market in the statin class and ended up being, a very lucrative drug. So it's really tricky. And I think also over time it has shifted. So now we see that the time difference between the first entrant and the second entrant used to be maybe 4-5 years. So you have plenty of time to get yourself established there with doctors and patients and so on. But now that time between first and second entrant is less than than a year, even for the new mechanism of action. So it just means that it's not the same as it used to be, and it's just a different game. You can definitely not relax, even if you're first and have, 6 or 9 months. We also have the priority review vouchers that people pay maybe $100 million for to save a few months on the regulatory timeline. So it's just extremely important to be first, but then get that foothold, because otherwise there'll be someone taking over. And we talk about it as if it's just, dead numbers and the TRX, NRX prescription data coming out. But remember, out there in real life, it's patients and doctors. And if doctors get a bad experience prescribing for the patients come back and they complain, or it's not efficacious, whatever. It's not like you didn't just change that perception overnight. It's a massive effort to change the mindsets of people, patients, and healthcare providers out there. So I think that's part of that mechanism, that it's, if you lose it, then it's probably in most cases lost for good, and the drug is almost dead on arrival.
As Jason said, right, sometimes there are nurses that just try to convince the doctor, oh, please don't prescribe that, right? And if that's a real example.
Yeah. And I think there are many good examples also in his book where it says, this is the mechanics at play. This is how it works, the prescribing patterns, what the doctor did, how the patient perceived it, how they came back. And that was just, not worth the trouble. So therefore they switched back to some other brand. So that, there's no forgiveness in the system that you get a second chance, or then it's hard earned to get the attention of prescribers, maybe the second or third time, to tell them a new story and try to reconfigure their mindset.
And especially, as he said, right, it's very hard to, once they set their mindset, it's very hard to change the mindset. So you also just have one chance at doing this. And now that you raised examples from the book, I might just close it with, because I found it very relevant to especially discussions you hear in pharma and biotech all the time, is everyone says they are all about differentiation, right? But as Jason said, it's about meaningful differentiation. And he had this beautiful example in his book where he said there's many products that were differentiated. You have the purple ketchup, you have the Cheeto lipstick. Those are all differentiated products, but they're differentiated in a way that no one simply cares about, right? And I think that's a very nice example. It's not just about differentiation. It's about a meaningful differentiation that meets a certain bar, and the bar is high.
Yeah. And I think if I can add one final comment to your final comment, one thing is the differentiators, the other thing is the qualifiers he also talks about in the book. You need to earn your way to even get to that conversation or get that attention to show that you're differentiated. And then he's very strong also in the conversation here that people hate giving up something they have already, the endowment effect. So there's a huge inertia in shifting from one thing to another. So again, it boils down to psychology, as in many other episodes, Martin, but I have nothing else to add.
No, this is all for me as well. So thank you very much for listening.
And check out our LinkedIn page. Just search for Cures and Capital. Leave a comment, read the book. All proceeds from the book goes to a very worthy cause, prostate cancer. And then maybe leave us a comment. What is the case study in the book that you thought was most insightful to you? And then also please let us know if you have ideas for future guests you want us to bring on. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.